Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Mary Rattan Hospital's weekly webinar. I'm Christy Barnes, Community Relations Coordinator for Mary Rattan Hospital, and I am so glad that you're here today. Can everyone hear me all right? If you could just raise a hand. Very good. Thank you so much. We have today with us Megan Arbogast, and she is a nurse practitioner with our internal medicine office and pediatric office, and she's going to be talking with us about resilience in children, how we can help with that and why it matters. So she will be introducing herself, so we are just going to go right ahead and get started with that, and I hope you enjoy the presentation today.
Good morning. My name is Megan Arbogast, and I'm a psychiatric and mental health nurse practitioner at Mary Rattan Hospital. Today I'm going to be doing a webinar on resiliency and fostering that in our youth. I have decided to do this as a PowerPoint as I thought it would be better to have slides and not have to stare at me for 30 minutes as I run through it. Right now with COVID-19 and social distancing, I think this is a wonderful time to be bridging into this. Keep in mind, it is a giant topic, and my goal is only to bring some familiarity to it and how to foster it. I'm hoping that the things that you take away from this, you can implement both in your lives at home and as teachers, coaches, and any other role you might play as an adult influencer. Resilience in children, why it matters, and how you can help. Despite our best efforts, we cannot prevent adversity and daily stress, but we can learn to be more resilient by changing how we think about challenges and adversities. I thought this was a pretty good quote to start off with. I think it's important we keep in mind that we're not trying to prevent adversity in our children's lives, but rather just improve their ability to cope and grow from these adverse experiences. So what is the definition of resilience? Webster says it's an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. The American Psychological Association says it's the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. I had 2 additional articles that I reference. The definitions are here. The one I liked a lot was actually this 4th one, with a child's ability to cope with ups and downs and bounce back from the challenges they experienced during childhood. For example, moving home, changing schools, studying for an exam, or dealing with the death of a loved one. One of the big things to remember about resilience is that this is something that is continually changing, continually growing, and there is no point in which it's too late to learn. Resilience is multifactorial. I decided to go ahead and focus on Dr. Ginsberg's 7 C's of resilience, as it was more thorough but pretty concise. Later in this presentation, I'll give a review on how we can help our children strengthen in these areas. Just to review what these are, there's competence, which describes that feeling of knowing that you can handle a situation effectively. There's confidence, which would be the child's belief in their own abilities. There's connection, developing close ties to family and community, leading to a solid sense of security. Character is a solid set of morals and values, right from wrong, and a caring attitude towards others. Contribution is this idea that children will need to realize that the world is a better place because they are in it. It can serve as a sense of purpose and motivation. There's coping, which is learning to cope effectively with stress, and control, learning that they can control the outcome of their decisions that will make them more likely to bounce back. So why does resilience matter? Well, youth and suicide. In 2017, suicide was the second leading cause of death for persons aged 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and 20 to 24. So from the ages of 10 to 24, the second leading cause of death was suicide. The number one was accidents. I went ahead and pulled over a graphic from the CDC just showing us age ranges and things that have taken children's lives. To think that the second leading cause is something that we actually can prevent tells us that we can make a pretty big impact in this. The CDC had reported in 2018 a 30% increase in suicide since 1999. So why is this? Well, surely it's untreated mental health conditions, right? Surprisingly, that's only about half true. 54% of those who died by suicide did not have a mental health condition that was known, and instead they were dealing with relationship problems, life stressors, or a recent impending crisis. The reason I mention this is this, again, is going to reinforce that resilience is going to be key. These aren't things that people are having chronic untreated mental health concerns. These are people who had a breakup, had a job loss, had some major adverse event, and didn't feel like they could get to the other side. When looking at resilience and suicide, I looked at a few articles. One was a presentation by a Robert Lewis who analyzed 100 studies looking at the links between resilience and stopping suicide attempts. These studies spanned over 3 decades. It was not specific to youth, so I will kind of give that disclosure. However, he found that the most significant factor of resilience contributing to the non-passage of the suicidal act is mainly solid relationships with significant others and a deep sense of existence. Another article I looked at showed that parent or caregiver relationships have been found to be the most significant protective factor in preventing adolescent suicide, even when it's compared to peers. I'll come back around to these topics when we start talking about how we're going to foster it with our youth, but just keep in mind that resilience and suicide have a pretty strong connection. So what happens when we have adversity, but we don't have the resilience in place? I have a little progressive sort of diagram here. It talks about stress and hardship in children that will then move to making alterations in brain development, which then leads to increased risk of cognitive and developmental delays, physical and mental health problems. So the idea here is if we are exposed to abuse and neglect and violence and mental illness in the caregivers and a lot of other things that we refer to as adverse childhood events or ACEs, we have true physical changes that happen in the brain. And then on top of that, some really significant outcomes that aren't just about depression or other mental health concerns, but there's even physical impacts like the diabetes and the heart disease. So resilience makes a big difference in many senses, and I sort of wanted to reinforce why it matters. So how do we build resilience? I wanted to refer back to those 7 C's I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. There's competence, confidence, connection, character, contribution, coping, and control. We're going to kind of go through all of those, not necessarily piece by piece, but in an encompassing way as the sort of big 4 overarching themes that I have later on in here will discuss these. As I begin to discuss fostering resilience, I feel compelled to talk about one of the overarching themes I see clinically in both child and adult psychiatry. People in general have a fear of negative feelings. Sadness, Anger, grief, remorse, jealousy, they're all parts of life, and to feel them is to be human. I've sat with a grieving child more than once, a teen who loses a friend to suicide, a young child who loses a grandparent, a young adult who has their heart broken. And in a desperate effort to not feel the pain or the grief or the sadness, they begin engaging in unhealthy coping. And then often their parents, with good intention, just want me to make it go away. However, these are not times that we turn to medication. Instead, I remind both the child and their parent that this is part of life. It is supposed to hurt. Emotions, even the uncomfortable ones, they're healthy. And rather than running from them or desperately trying to mask them with alcohol or drugs or reckless behaviors or just plain denial, we want them to embrace those. To do that, we teach children to sit in those emotions, to feel sadness, to feel disappointment, to feel anger. By doing so, you're going to take the power away from those emotions and hand it back to the child. It's important to even give the feelings names. I feel sad. I feel disappointed. I feel mad. Of course, your vocabulary is going to change depending on the age of the child, but keeping it simple at first will be easy for your younger toddlers, and then you'll kind of adapt that as they get older. It's important that when we do give it names and we allow them to vocalize it, that not only are you going to let them know, hey, that's normal to feel, but you can also let them know in that time then that they're not going to feel like this forever. We're also validating it by using these phrases with them. I feel sad, and you can respond, I'm sorry that you feel sad, or I hear that you feel sad, or I know that you feel sad. The more we validate negative feelings and then positive coping skills, the more skilled the child becomes in doing so themselves. Additionally, I've always found it helpful later to constructively reflect with them about how they initially might have responded to something. And then, this is after they de-escalate and you have. Then you also look at sort of the things that they could have done. So did they yell and become argumentative? Did they throw things? We'll look at the situation, we'll look at the response, and then we'll talk about better ways to handle it in the future. Rather than this being punitive, at this point, we should only be reviewing what's going on. You're going to have them talk through it and then encourage them to come up with some healthy alternatives themselves. For example, you might be saying to them, when I told you to get off your video games, how did you feel? And what did you do because you felt so angry? And what could you have done differently instead? In the case of my son, who I gave full disclosure I was pulling into this, and I got permission, I've always noticed that when he begins to emotionally spiral, the words just start to flow out. And what would have been like a small consequence quickly escalates to a larger one because he'll just keep upping the ante. I've begun to learn that rather than responding to him in a way that it becomes about me winning with consequences, to instead try to respond by reminding him to be mindful of what's happening with his emotions. I'll often encourage for him to take a moment to pause and consider the outcome before continuing to respond the way he may be choosing at that moment. It's been pretty helpful for us in diffusing situations which almost always would go from minor infractions to catastrophes by the end of the night. I'm not saying that there are not consequences for behaviors. In fact, we'll get to that later because there needs to be consequences for behaviors. But I do think after the fact, we need to be reviewing what happened and what we could have done differently. And in addition to that, it can't be punitive at that point. At that point, it's all about growth. The talk isn't about coping skills, but I did also want to throw in here that you can easily Google tons of them. I threw a few in here as well, like journaling, exercise, meditation, and prayer, just quiet time. But feel free to go online. There's great handouts you can print out. You can go through them with your kiddos and just kind of be prepared. So I also want to pause right now to say that even though I mentioned the families coming in sometimes and feeling like medication is going to be the answer, and me sort of rebutting that with, no, we need to feel these feelings, that there are absolutely times though where medication is indicated in children. And in certain circumstances, it is going to be during an acute trauma or loss. Sometimes we'll use them temporarily to aid in sleep or decrease nightmares or decrease significant panic, or maybe even decrease the risk of harm to themselves or somebody else. Additionally, psychiatric medicines are both indicated and helpful when a psychiatric diagnosis has been made, as long as it's creating a significant impairment in the child's life that is not or cannot improve with adjunct treatment. Things like therapy, parent training, etc. A lot of times we'll do those together, but certainly the first trial should be without medication unless this is something, we find serious enough to jump straight to that. I think it's also really pertinent to mention that untreated mental illness can also lead to pretty poor resilience, as chronic depression would, impact any of those 7 C's I referred to earlier. For the purpose going forward, though, of the webinar, I'm really just focusing on healthy, appropriate emotions that can and will arise during adversity. I just don't want to kind of get the two things confused, because resilience doesn't take place of medication in certain situations, but also don't ever feel like medications are going to take the place of resilience. So I went over validating feelings and some coping. Next, I wanted to look at being the connection. At the beginning, I talked about that quote that the parent or caregiver relationships have been found to be the most significant protective factor in preventing adolescent suicide. This is even when compared to peers. I think it's important that we remember that connection is key. It's cited repeatedly in literature that connection with a trusted adult is the strongest predictor of resiliency in youth. Parents and caregivers are noted in the things that I was saying earlier, but there's also multiple other studies that have looked at teachers and coaches and mentors as well. They found that when children are exposed to things that are adverse events that we've mentioned earlier, like the poverty or abuse or neglect or things at home where maybe they're not getting the trusted adult, that the teachers and the coaches, they made a difference as well. So don't underestimate what the power of connection can do with any of the kids that you may cross paths with in your life in different functions. Other thing I wanted to mention was resilient adults encourage resilient children. So all of these things that I'm going to talk about, we should be fostering them in ourselves. We should be trying to validate our own emotions, give them names, sit in them, be okay with them, because the more that we do these types of things, we're really teaching it to our kids as well. We also need to be able to accept failure and all the other things I'm going to kind of discuss here in the forthcoming slides. But just don't forget that the healthier you are, the healthier your children are going to be. So we've validated feelings, we've created a connection. Now we want to encourage independence and, providing some autonomy and responsibility to the child. Not only does it empower them to feel confident and they're just in their own decision making, but it's going to teach them that their choices are going to bring with it good and bad consequences, which they can often control themselves. Rather than them being victims of circumstance, we're going to reinforce that outcomes are a result of action or even at times inaction. If the decision isn't a health or a safety concern, try to give the child as much control over their decisions as reasonably possible. Make sure it's age appropriate. If it's a toddler, we can be asking them which color cup they want. And then as they get older, we can grow those decisions with them. Also, I know I talk about allowing some adversity, but don't necessarily seek it out. If we know that your kid loves French toast and when you ask them what they want for breakfast, that's probably what they're going to request. Maybe instead give them a decision if you don't have it in the house, so that you don't sort of bring on some issues in the morning that you probably don't really want to take on early. So again, kind of walk that line. You're going to empower them to make decisions, but we're not going to like continually throw things out their way either. With the decision making, even if they make things though, like decisions though, that are bringing about less than desirable outcomes, we want to encourage some growth from that rather than trying to fix it. So if your kid uses their allowance to buy a cheap toy and it breaks after like 10 minutes, try to resist the urge of going out and replacing it for them. You can validate the disappointment, but don't fix it. This is true as the disappointments get larger too. Our kids are going to fail. They're going to be cut from sports teams. They're going to try out for a solo they're not going to get. They're going to study for a test and not do poorly. They're going to have friends who end up treating them bad. Try not to initially get upset with coaches and instructors and teachers and friends, but instead sit with your kids in those moments of disappointment. Sort of empower them and assist them to do what they need to do to handle this and maybe change the outcome. Could they have practiced more for the team? Could they have studied different or clarified more with the teacher on what the expectations were? Could they do that now for the next exam to change the next outcome? If this is like with peer relationships or really any of them, is this something that this individual can be approached by them and their actions can be sort of discussed? Or is it just healthier that you say, hey, let's just establish some boundaries with them, and we're going to decide not to really interact with them if they're not bringing to us a healthy relationship? I'm not saying that you never go to the school, that you never speak with a coach. What I am saying is we can't keep kids from being sad and disappointed. And if we can really empower them to then take on those moments, have those tough conversations, interact with these, people that they see as kind of ranking as more superior to them, it's going to make them feel more confident in the future to continue doing so. It also means, hey, I failed that test because I didn't listen to all the extra supplemental reading I was supposed to do. I spoke with my teacher about it. They gave me this idea. And then look, I did great on the next one. And all of it were things that they did themselves. They fixed it. They saw they could be resilient. The key is going to be giving them as much control that you can on decisions, but also encourage them. So I was thinking back on, examples to give, and the whole teaching them to ride a bike, of course, comes to mind. Initially you were staying close with them. You might have used some training wheels or something, some other form of progression. And then as their skill and confidence grew, so did your distance from them. If they fell, you would just kind of encourage them to get on and do it again. You might discuss what went wrong. But then as they got better and they started riding off unassisted, you just kind of crossed your fingers and hoped they didn't crash into the bush around the corner. But at the same time, you accepted that that was a consequence that could occur. It's, life. It's going to bring disappointments. And it's a lot better that they learn to manage the small ones so that then when the big ones happen, they've got a shot at overcoming those as well. It really does seem insignificant for us to let small things happen. And none of us enjoy seeing children that we care about being sad, feeling disappointed, but just understand that this really is part of healthy growth. It really is, in the long run, setting them up for success when bigger things occur that they also, couldn't prevent and now need to get to the other side of. And then again, sometimes they can prevent it. And we sort of talked about that too, making different choices in the future. The last thing I sort of wanted to touch on in fostering resilience was growing a deep sense of existence. Character and contribution are pretty closely related. Character is the idea that you develop a solid set of morals and values to determine right from wrong. It also includes having like a caring attitude, whereas contribution is all about how am I making the world a better place because I'm in it. Remember that I mentioned that the other protective factor in suicide was a deep sense of existence. So, kind of more simple way to say that would just be a purpose. I had read a pretty powerful piece on this, and it really enforced this idea that giving, um, it wasn't so much amazing for those that received the acts, but actually for those that were doing it. The act of service itself is bringing purpose and in turn fostering resilience. I, though, have found not only for it to be helpful in that regard, but in the reverse, that when we do meet adversity, if we can create purpose from it, that too is going to nurture resilience. On the small scale, that's going to be something like taking a rained out pool day and repurposing it into a day that we're going to make cookies for a nursing home. On a larger scale, it's going to be taking a moment that's changed our lives or our children's lives, like the loss of a friend to suicide. And, they might create purpose by becoming an advocate in their school and the community for suicide prevention. Purposing adversity not only grows a sense of why we need to continue with existence, but it also minimizes the victim mentality that things just happen to us and replaces it with empowerment and a sense of control again. I think that pretty much wraps up the things I wanted to touch on. Um, I gave you about 4 slides here, looking at those ways that we could foster it. It's validating emotions, giving them names, being the connection, that adult connection that they need, encouraging their independence and their confidence, and then, really growing a deep sense of existence, typically through the acts of service and kindness. These types of things are really going to encourage resilience, give them better outcomes. And like I said, it's a growing thing. You're never at the end of resilience. You're always going to be fostering better things, watching them grow, watching them develop them. So don't feel like, it's too late if you feel like they're struggling, and don't feel like it's ever too early. This can kind of happen from day one. So if you have any questions, I actually had one more slide here. I have an app slide. It's apps for children and adolescents. I got this actually just off of a website. It was called resilientchildtherapy.com. So you're welcome to kind of take a peek at this. There's the Stop, Breathe, and Think app that's both for kids and adults. It's free. There's the Calm app and Headspace, which are pretty popular and also free. And then the Snap Stories About Feelings. It looks like it's only for MacBook or Mac, I should say, but and it has a small charge, but it's for kids to learn about managing their own feelings. And then New Notes is something they can use to sort of journal their feelings. So a lot of this really focuses on just being very aware of how you're feeling and then how you're handling that. Again, empowerment is key. And then my last slide is resources. So I kind of wanted to throw those out there again and then just say thanks. I really appreciate everybody listening in, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
All right, that was Megan Arbogast bringing us our webinar today. I do want to thank you for being a part, and as usual, if you have questions for Megan, you're welcome to jot them down in the chat section or the question and answer section, and we will have Megan get the answers to those or respond to those, and we'll email those out to you in a day or so. Coming up next week, June 2nd, we're already into June, hard to believe, but Dr. Trevor Maurer will be with us. He is with Mary Rutan Hospital Pediatrics, and he is going to talk with us about vaccines, truths and myths. So again, Dr. Maurer next week. We'll be sending out some information on that, the web link, and also putting that out on Facebook for anyone who wants to sign up for that webinar. So with that, I hope you have a great day and a great week ahead, and thank you for joining us.